Good evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher, and I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here at the museum. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. The museum is celebrating an important anniversary this month. On Monday, Valentine's Day, the museum will mark its 10th anniversary, which is a significant milestone, yes. And it's a milestone not only for those of us who work or volunteer at the museum or who serve on the board of directors, it's a milestone for the city of Las Vegas, which got this ball rolling, and for the residents of this city who have seen this museum enrich the cultural fabric of the community and generate a fair share of economic benefit as well. Our program this evening is titled The Story of the Mob Museum, celebrating its past, charting its future. And celebrate is what we intend to do with this conversation, as well as provide a little historical education and stories to help understand a little bit more about our museum. As you can see, our panel tonight is big and possibly unwieldy. But these individuals all have played significant roles in the development of the museum. They have some great stories and insights that will help illustrate the truly amazing place in which we all find ourselves on a Thursday night in February. I'd like to start by introducing the panelists, and I've truncated their bios just a little. We could do a whole program on each bio, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to start from closest to me and work my way over. Melissa Warren is principal owner of the Warren Group, the next evolution of Fess Foley Warren Public Relations, for whom she served as managing partner for nearly 2 decades. The Warren Group represents many of Southern Nevada's leading companies, developers, retail centers, government agencies, municipalities, and nonprofits. Please welcome Melissa Warren. Bob Stoldahl enjoyed a long career in television journalism, serving as a reporter, news anchor, creator of a 24-hour Las Vegas cable news operation, and as the news director of 2 local network affiliates. Stoldahl produced the award-winning documentary Mob on the Run, a detailed look at the history of organized crime in Las Vegas. He serves on the boards of several community organizations, including the Mob Museum. Bob was just in short pants in 1920. In 2020, he was a recipient of a Distinguished Nevadan Award from the University of Nevada Board of Regents. Please welcome Bob Stoldahl. Oscar Goodman served 12 years as the mayor of Las Vegas. Before turning to politics, he was a criminal defense attorney of great renown. He spent more than 35 years defending mob figures, including Meyer Lansky, alleged mob figures. I always forget that. I always forget the alleged. Frank Rosenthal and Tony Spilatro. He is the original visionary of the Mob Museum, where he serves on the board of directors. Please welcome Oscar Goodman. Jeff Silver served on the Nevada Gaming Control Board during the state's tumultuous period of clearing organized crime influence, or alleged organized crime influence, from the casino industry. Afterward, he held top leadership positions at a number of hotel casinos, including the Landmark, Riviera, and Caesars Palace. He is a former chairman of the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce and former secretary-treasurer of the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. He is currently the board chair of the Mob Museum. In 2020, not 1920, in 2020, he was inducted into the American Gaming Association's Gaming Hall of Fame. Please welcome Jeff Silver. Jonathan Ullman is president and CEO of the Mob Museum. Reporting to a 22-member board of directors, Jonathan is responsible for leading the organization that has been named both a top workplace and best museum by the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and ranked number 20 on TripAdvisor's list of top museums in the United States, as if we didn't know, right? Jonathan's museum career began at Liberty Science Center in New Jersey's most visited museum, where he was intimately involved in strategic planning and operations following a $109 million capital expansion. Immediately before joining the Mob Museum, Jonathan was the president and COO of the National Soccer Hall of Fame. Please welcome Jonathan Ullman. Scott Adams is retired as the city manager of the city of Las Vegas. He has held numerous positions in the field of urban economic development, including Chief Urban Redevelopment Officer and Director of the Office of Business Development for the city of Las Vegas. Scott has been instrumental in making significant changes in each community he has worked in through involvement in master planning, public-private partnerships, and business development. Please welcome Scott Adams. Mike Devine is president of Gallagher Museum Services, the business strategy and planning division within the museum exhibit design firm Gallagher & Associates. And if you don't know, that name will come up again later. Mike has more than 25 years of financial investment and operational related experience, including more than 20 years of museum and cultural center experience. He's been involved with some of the most well-respected cultural attractions around the country, led, of course, by the Mob Museum. Please welcome Mike Devine. And last but certainly not least, a native Nevadan, Nancy Diener began working for the city of Las Vegas, overseeing its visual arts programs. She ultimately helped the city form a department dedicated to arts and culture called the Office of Cultural Affairs and became its first director. In 2006, she received the Governor's Arts Award for Service to the Arts for her work on the development of two museums, the Mob Museum and the Neon Museum, as well as other arts initiatives such as the Percent for Art Ordinance, First Friday, and the Vegas Valley Book Festival. Please welcome Nancy Diener. All right, it's been a great night. I think we can call it. No. My hope is our discussion this evening progresses somewhat chronologically from the origins of the museum to its opening 10 years ago to the present and the future. Of course, we'll deviate from this timeline for here and there, but that's the general idea. I think it's appropriate that we start with Oscar. Oscar will get the first word and the last word tonight, as you might expect. Oscar, if you might, could you sort of kick it off by talking about the idea that you came up with to create a mob museum in Las Vegas?
Thank you, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. Is this working? Yes. Okay, good. I was elected the mayor, and I went up to the 10th floor of City Hall and looked out and saw this building where I tried my first federal case. And I said, what's happening to the old courthouse and post office? And people shrugged, and I said, let's find out. And we called up the GSA, which is the agency which is in charge of federal businesses and property. And they said that this is a surplus piece. I said, what does that mean? They said, you could buy it. I said, I want to buy it. I said, how much? They said, $1 on the condition that you restore it to its original condition, and 2, that it be used for cultural purposes like a museum. I said, we have a deal. So we had the idea that we're going to have the building. We weren't going to raise it. We weren't going to destroy it like they implode all the buildings in this community here. We were going to preserve the old Las Vegas and keep this building intact. And I went home that night and I said, you know, I don't think that people would come downtown, because we have to think back. In those days, this downtown was rubble. It was blighted. I didn't even know what those words meant when I was elected, but I found out real soon that it was like the other places around the country that were falling apart in the inner cities. And I said, we have to have something that will attract people down here and yet be important as far as our culture is concerned. And people will not come to an art museum. I know that because I was raised in a cultural family back east, and my parents use the art museum every Saturday as my babysitter. They drop me off, and then they pick me up at the end of the day, and they would be charged with child neglect. If this was happening today, they'd probably be in prison still. But I would spend time there. I'd look at the pictures. I'd look at the armor of the knights and everything. I said, but that won't go in downtown Las Vegas, even though I love art and I love sculpture. But no one's going to come downtown to see sculpture. And then the light bulb went on. I said, we're different than any other place in the world. We were born from the mob. I want a mob museum. Now, I was the kind of mayor who didn't do any work, unlike my wife, who works all the time. I would just sit in my office and I would pontificate and go to a fellow like Scott or go to Nancy and I would say, I want. And I said, I want a mob museum. Well, what do you mean? I said, I want to have a mob museum. Well, people began to whisper about this mob museum. What is that going to do to our reputation? And I wanted to say, of Sin City? I didn't think it would hurt too much, but I wasn't about to fight them until I ran into a bastion of Italian-American folks who said I was going to set back the Italian-American community 200 years. I was going to ruin everything for them, and they got angry, and I held a meeting at the Justinian Society, which is a wonderful group of Italian-Americans who give money in order to create scholarships for people, and I went in there, and they were booing me. And they said, how dare you do this? How dare you demean us? I said, what do you mean demean you? I said, we're going to have a mob museum. I said, don't worry about it. Well, it got so bad, I thought they were going to hurt me. And I am a coward at heart, and I did not want to be beat up by these Italians because they were big, and a lot of them didn't have necks even, and it reminded me of my clientele. And I didn't want to end up out in the desert, so I said, what did you think I said? They said, a mob museum. I said, mob? Are you kidding? I said, a mop museum. I said, I want a museum that's dedicated to vacuum cleaners and brooms and brushes. That's what I said. Well, finally they said, well, do whatever you have to do. And then the magic moment came, which made us legitimate. We had a wonderful FBI, this is me talking, a wonderful FBI special agent in charge who had just retired. And I gave her the key to the city as the mayor. And I said, I'd really like to talk to you afterwards, Ms. Knowlton. It was Ellen Knowlton. And I spoke to her and I said, Ms. Knowlton, you could do the city and me a giant favor. She said, I'm not going to do you any favors, Mr. Goodman. You never did us any favors. I said, well, let's put ourselves above this. I'd like to talk to you. And I said, wouldn't it be great if you became the director, the chairman of the board of this mob museum that we're contemplating? And she didn't say no right away. She said, let me think about it. And she went back to Washington, D.C., to the J. Edgar Hoover building, and she spoke to the folks there and explained what the story was, and they said, you have our blessing. And they said, go forth and be what Mr. Goodman's asking you to do, and also tell him that we're going to provide memorabilia and material for this museum. The only thing that we want an even-handedness. This is not to glorify Goodman or the mob or crime. This has to be the story of law enforcement and its fight against the mob and the truth as to how it's taking place. And she said, I'd be happy to do that. And overnight, it was like Cinderella in the pumpkin. Overnight, everybody said, you know, this museum of organized crime and law enforcement may have something to it. And they said, if it's what they say it's going to be, it could be the greatest thing that happened to Las Vegas. It could revitalize that entire area. And I have to say one thing, because I have to be naughty. I'm sorry. I have to. There was one councilman who said, if I can't help it, he said, and his name's Bob Beers, so it doesn't matter. There'll be no secret here. He says, if that museum is successful, I will take my clothes off and I will run through the downtown. We voted against it because it would have been so disgusting to see this. He was a little heavy at the time. Running through the downtown, we gave him a pass. But how wrong he's been. And I have to say this because I'm probably not going to be welcome to say anything else. This community is so lucky that they had folks who were on the board of directors and associated with the museum who did it for love of Las Vegas. They donated their time, their expertise, lawyers, accountants, architects, one after another, to be able to create this phenomenal museum. And there's one person I have to pay tribute to who is not here tonight, and that's Dennis Barry. Dennis Barry was the designer of the interior. and the man who created the many exhibits that are in the building. And I met him, and I didn't like him. I told him I didn't like him. He was sort of, he reminded me of a weakling. He reminded me of somebody who wasn't strong. And I said, well, let's think about this. And that night I went home and got half drunk. No, I was fully drunk, to be honest with you. And I'm looking, because not only am I a drunk, but I'm a degenerate gambler too. I was looking for a ball game, and I came across a movie. And the movie was called Dirty Dealing. And it was a story of a museum in Cincinnati. And it was going to have an exhibit of Robert Mapplethorpe, who was an avant-garde artist, photographer, and the like, who created very controversial pieces with sexual overtones. And they said to Dennis, who was the conservator of the museum, if you have this exhibit, we're going to indict you. And he said, no one is going to be able to shut down the First Amendment as long as I'm in this job and freedom of expression. And he said, we're going to have the exhibit. And I'm watching this on TV, I'm saying, this guy is something else. I like him. I mean, he's maybe the strongest guy I ever met, because he put his face right in the government's face, and he was right. And they indicted him for having this kind of exhibit in the museum. And he went to trial, and he could have gone to prison. And people were pointing at Cincinnati as being Sin City because they allowed an exhibit like this to take place. And jury took 1 hour, not guilty. And I said to myself, if this man will associate himself with this museum, and we could have the quality of that kind of strength and creativity, he's my kind of guy. I apologized to him. I said I was wrong. You may not be able to tell a book by its cover, and that's why I'm going to keep my mouth shut and listen to people a lot smarter than myself tell you the real story.
Thank you. Now, Oscar mentioned Ellen Knowlton. She was our first chairperson, and she was unfortunately not able to be here this evening, but I did do an interview with her via Zoom recently, and we want to show a little clip from that. Some of this story that she tells is going to sound familiar from what Oscar said, but it adds to it. So let's watch that.
I was retiring from the FBI after 24 years. And during my retirement ceremony, Mayor Oscar presented me with the key to the city. So obviously I was very thrilled to have that. And I reached out to take it from him, and he didn't let go. And he leans over and he whispers in my ear, I got something I want you to do. And I said, okay, who do I have to kneecap? And he started laughing, and he said, no. He said, I'm working on a project. It's just started out, and I was wondering if now that you're retired, if you could help us out. And so, I said, sure, I'll at least think about it. So I met with him about a week later. And then he told me that the city of Las Vegas had been gifted the old federal courthouse for $1 from the federal government, but the agreement was that it would be turned into something for public use. So the idea that he had was to turn it into a museum that featured the history of Las Vegas as it was shaped by organized crime. So I thought, wow, that is out there. But I agreed to go to a few of the meetings just to get a flavor for, what this project was going to look like. And honestly, I was so impressed with the team that the city had put together. Obviously, representatives from the mayor's office, the Office of Cultural Affairs, the city attorney's office, engineering, They had financial experts on board that could guide us in terms of not-for-profit organization. And so I got on board. I was just very impressed. All the professionals. And then when I started meeting the design team people, they were awesome too, headed up by Dennis and Kathy Berry, Gallagher and Associates. So it just seemed like it was a dream team of people that were assembled and were committed to doing it.
Hold on, a little more.
I was very concerned that we'd not put a project forward that actually would glorify organized crime. I thought that is the wrong message to send, and it's not true that it's a glamorous lifestyle. So that was first and foremost to me, not to glorify organized crime activities. And then secondly, I wanted to ensure that law enforcement, and in particular the FBI, but all law enforcement, that would be fairly and accurately represented.
One more.
The project received intense scrutiny by politicians, by the media, and by some members of the public. But I always felt that the project had so much integrity that people would see for themselves what we were able to portray and how accurate it was. So we had a particularly vocal city councilman who had been critical of the project publicly. And he made the statement that if the museum, in fact, actually did open its doors, that he would run through the building naked. So after we opened, the board of directors decided to not hold him to that vow, so we let him off the hook for that one. But I took the criticism, as like a personal challenge. And, if anything, it motivated me even more to do anything I could to move the project forward and have it be successful. So it didn't really bother me. I just thought they'll see, they'll get it eventually.
All right, thank you. I'd like to, this moment, step back a little bit before before Oscar gets involved directly with the creation of the Mob Museum, and turn to Nancy Diener, who was, there from the beginning, as they say. And I thought, Nancy, if you could talk briefly about acquiring the building and then figuring out what you want to do with it. I think that would be an interesting Genesis story.
Sure, I'm happy to. Hope this is on. Okay.
Yep.
So actually, we're going back to 2001 when the discussion between the GSA and the mayor's office was taking place. The federal government's GSA, General Services Administration, was deaccessioning post offices all over America in downtown areas because they felt that people weren't coming downtowns as much and they were going to their malls and strip malls and suburbs. So these buildings were built, and many of them were historic and beautiful, and they would go to the cities and see if they wanted them. So when the mayor talked to the government, it was like perfect timing. So the GSA said, sure, we'll give you a quitclaim deed. And that occurred, so the discussion took place in 2001. The city then turned it over to GMA Architects to do a reuse feasibility study, just to do due diligence on it. And they said, fine, it works. It was a quick study. So then in 2002, I think it was March, the GSA deeded here in this courtroom, deeded it over. We had a little ceremony and a cake. And we took control of it, and we went, now what? So we brought in Robert Chattel and Chattel Architecture and Urban Planning, and a woman by the name of Carol Goldstein, and they were hired to do a report on reuse and adaptability. And Robert's expertise is looking at historic architectural buildings, and there's designations. I learned an awful lot about historic buildings and fiber and fabric and what goes into them. Right after we hired him, we hired Griswold and Associates, also think this might have been in 2003. And what they do is they come in and they look at the building and they determine what the original paint color was. I spent the day with them peeling up the carpet to find that there were cork floors here. We thought this was all beige and white, but in reality, you can look at the beautiful colors, this gold, the red. These were all original paint colors of 1932, 31, 32. So it turned out to be a labor of love for many of us here, especially those who grew up here, because we just didn't have this many historic buildings. And I would do a lot of work in here. I'd come in, and the Social Security Administration was located down the hall, and there was a visiting judge. He would come, and he was from Boston, and he had a thick Boston accent. And I said, "We love this building." And he said, "They're a dime a dozen in Boston." And I said, "But they aren't here. The first elevator in Las Vegas is this elevator. Not exactly this one, but yes, the first elevator." So that we proceeded forward. Robert and Carol turned in a report, I think it was in 2004. It took them about a year to get the report done. So the city did its due diligence to look to find a museum that would reflect accurately the history of this building where the Kefauver hearings took place. Robert Chattel, with Chattel's help, got it onto the National Register of Historic Places because of the Kefauver hearings, and it became very apparent that our mayor was brilliant from the get-go, and that to talk about the story of organized crime and law enforcement was to do the building justice by recreating its history. Plus, we knew and we felt, and we were trying very hard to think of a museum that would bring people in so that it wouldn't fall back on taxpayers and it wouldn't be constantly looking for money, that what would people really want to see? And the mayor was absolutely right. So in 2004, they completed their study. Then in 2006, the city did a national search for an architecture firm. They hired Westlake Reed and Laskowski, who brought in Gallagher and Associates, and Dennis and his wife, Kathy Berry.
Those are the early years. And one person who became involved relatively early was Mike Devine. And so I thought, Mike, why don't you talk a little bit about how you became involved with the museum and what you were helping us do?
Great, thanks, Jeff. So we had opened the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. in 2002, and that museum was one of the very first, if maybe the only, for-profit museums in the country. I was working with Dennis Berry, Gallagher and Associates, which is where I'm at now, was our exhibit designer. And the success of that museum was really highlighted in, I got a call actually from Betsy Fretwell, who was the city manager at the time. And she had asked about, why was it so successful? Because that time, the Penn Quarter in DC was a blighted area as well. As Mayor Oscar was saying, had a lot of the same qualities as where Vegas was at the time. And this spy museum was just a major catalyst to the economic development of the Penn Quarter of Washington, D.C. So Betsy called and said, we know you guys were involved with the spy museum. Would you like to come out to Vegas and look at it? I was working directly with Dennis. So Dennis was, I keep saying, the right side of the brain, the creative side. I was the left side of the brain, working on business plan, operational planning, financial planning. And the conversations with Betsy was, we need to form this new 501c3. We need an operating model that we think is going to be long-term sustainable, as Nancy just said. And so that's kind of how we got started. And it was WRL, the architects, and Gallagher and Associates, the Berries, and myself, kind of as the museum team that came in 07, 08, I think is when we started. Really to kind of think about the complex as a whole, both from a creative side as well as a business, operational, and planning side.
Perfect. One thing you need to do a project like this is money. And as Nancy has told me, there wasn't a lot of money at first. But Scott, you were the person, or one of the people who was very involved in finding money to do this project. How did that kind of unfold?
Well, it was interesting. I would characterize the Mob Museum as a great concept and great content in search of big money. Up to, I think it was probably about 2008, 2009, there had been a myriad of various grants that had been brought into the project. It enabled a lot of the stuff that they'd already talked about to go forward and get started. But there was still the bulk of the money to complete construction and get the building built needed. And I vividly remember having a meeting, and actually it was in I was then the business development director of the city, in our conference room, where we mapped out a financing strategy to build the Smith Center, because it fell short of its funding needs. They were trying to privately raise money, and we were heading into a recession, and it was pretty difficult to do that at the time. We wanted to build a new city hall, and we needed design money for that, and then we needed the balance of the money for the Mob Museum. So we got laid out on a whiteboard a funding strategy where the redevelopment agency would issue bonds. Those bonds would go into each of those projects. And then we also did something which you can't do anymore, which is borrow from the sewer fund. The city's sewer fund had a really big fund balance, and we loaned the project's money from the sewer fund, and it was being repaid out of the redevelopment agency. So with all that put together, and this was going right into the recession, we were able to pull off getting this project funded, but the other two big projects funded, which really was a big boost in the arm of downtown at that point in time.
Well, as you mentioned, the recession was hitting, and yet all of these projects happened. They were really the only thing going on, right, in the city?
They were, and quite frankly, I think downtown weathered that recession a little bit better than most parts of the region because of that activity that was going on downtown.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to go back to something that Ellen and Oscar both mentioned, and ask Jeff about this. There were skeptics early on, and you know, there were skeptics, and there was competitors. There were all kinds of challenges. What do you recall about how we responded to that?
Well, first I want to say that we were all very fortunate that Oscar Goodman was our mayor. He's an amazing guy. I mean, he's very self-effacing and very humble about things, and I want to give him the opportunity to get the credit that he really deserves. I mean, his tenacity in making something happen is reflective of the fact that he was a populist mayor, elected for 3 terms, and his service was recognized to the extent that his wife now has had a similar experience, and she's an amazing mayor as well. So we're all very fortunate that the Goodman family has been with us because they really belie all of the successes that we've had here. The stars did align. And although it could have been a joke, it could have been a dream, it could have been just an idle thought, but essentially those seeds germinated into something that has turned out to be very special. I look at like Dennis Berry, for example, and his wife Kathy. A lot of people have an idea for a musical, a production, a book, and it's just an idea. But as lawyers know, when they make a presentation in a case before a jury, you have to tell a story. And the story that Dennis Berry was skilled to tell was based upon his years growing up and having gone to museums like Oscar, and seeing that in this particular case, he wasn't afraid of controversial projects. If the Mapplethorpe exhibit is any example, and he did that before the Mob Museum, he certainly didn't shy away from any type of controversy. And in fact, he put his skills to work to tell a story. He interviewed a lot of people. He interviewed me about some of the things that went on with some of Oscar's clients and happened in Las Vegas. And he wove those into a compelling tale about life in America and organized crime's role in life as it shaped the history of our country. And starting with the unions and the immigrants and so on, all the things that happened, it was a compelling tale. And he also knew one other thing, that of visitation to museums, only about 2.5% or so are locals. They're all from somewhere else going to a museum as a part of their view of a city or entertainment. And in this particular case, Las Vegas was an open city. And for organized crime, I grew up here in Las Vegas, for organized crime, they came from all different parts of the country, from the East Coast, from the Midwest, from California. And they brought with them their organized crime issues that were all of a fascination for the local people that live there, who were our visitors, our visitor volume. And so it was an idea that needed to happen. And it caught fire because of the tenacity of Oscar and the skills of Dennis and some of the other people, and Gallagher Associates and so on, that have been mentioned here. And you can't discount the fact that even though Ellen Knowlton, who I say all the time has been the catalyst to make all of this happen because of her legitimacy, not that Oscar is illegitimate, but the fact of the matter is that the fact that she agreed to serve in this capacity as our first chairman, and the fact that she had just come as the special agent in charge of the local FBI office here in Las Vegas, and was a wonderful person besides that. That said a lot about how we were going to play this as the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement, and to tell both sides of the story, which is our logo. And that has prevailed all the way to the present time when we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. And it went to the point of when we hired Jonathan as our director. And nobody is more responsible for the successes that we've had here in the implementation of the product and the ideas and the concepts and working with people than Jonathan has been. I understand his original interview for this job was a horrendous experience for him. He was grilled pretty heavily by me in terms of his qualifications to serve as our first managing director at that time. Now he's CEO and he's the chief executive of everything. But at the time, I wanted to make sure that Jonathan had the backbone and the guts to stand up to the criticisms that our community was throwing at Oscar, the populist mayor, and some of the other naysayers about the museum and its financing and its creativity. And he performed very well during the course of the interview, even though it was a tough one for him, and he didn't realize how well he did. He was hired immediately thereafter, as soon as he left the room, but he got away before we could tell him. And the fact of the matter is that the people in Las Vegas weren't convinced about this right away. And it took some of the people that were involved in the museum, not only Ellen, but some of the other people that I'm going to mention right now. Alan Feldman from the MGM, Melissa, of course, and her responsibilities to promote the museum. It took a lot of different people who agreed to serve on the board. Chris Kempfer, who is a great attorney, or is a great attorney that does zoning and planning. He was a vital component of this. Valerie Merzel, who is an expert in human relations and human resources. These are all people who agreed to serve and fill a niche, a capacity at the museum to provide the necessary expertise and the team, the star team that went forward. And I don't necessarily count myself among them, but I do say that we had a lot of people who were dedicated to the museum and provided just that necessary piece of expertise and advice that carried us through to what we have today. So yes, there was a problem in getting everybody on board, but it was all there. The stars aligned, and this was the perfect storm. And look what we've done. We're so happy about it.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to ask Mike just real quick to tell the rest, the final part of the story of Jonathan's hiring, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I think Jeff was being kind, saying it was an interview. I think Jonathan probably thought it was more of an interrogation in general. And so, as Jeff said, we had interviewed, I think, 4 or 5 candidates that day, and the committee immediately, right after the 5 candidates went through, immediately selected Jonathan. It was kind of a clear-cut chase. But Jonathan left immediately, and then Dennis Berry, Ellen, and myself decided to go to lunch right afterwards. And so we're driving downtown to go to lunch, and we see Jonathan literally on the street shuffling his feet, tide hanging down. Come on. It looked like he had just, lost his best friend. And we get in the parking lot to the restaurant, and I think we were all like, should we say something? What do we do here? It was kind of very awkward, right? And so we just wave him over, and he ends up coming over, and we go through the cafe line and get lunch, and ended up offering him the job right there in that restaurant. So that was in close quarters, if I remember correctly. It was fun, though. It was great.
Thank you. I want to get back to Jonathan in a minute. He hasn't had a chance to say anything, but he will. But before we do that, I want to turn to Bob because Bob Stoldahl, Las Vegas historian, very important to the development of the museum. Bob, you were involved a little bit with probably one of the most important things that happened before the museum opened, which was the acquisition of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre wall bricks. And that happened in 2009, so that's like 3 years before the museum opened. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I will, but I'm going to take 30 seconds in advance of that, and just want to highlight the hiring of Jonathan. We had, as was said, 5 candidates that day, all qualified. It was Dennis and Ellen Knowlton and myself and Jeff. We're going through, and they're all qualified to one degree or another, some less and some more. And Jonathan was the last candidate. And I'm asking him about his education. I mean, all the things you do in an interview, about this and where you went to school and so forth. And Ellen's asking kind of the same things. And it comes to Jeff, and he brings out a spotlight and turns it right on Jonathan's face and says, "Who the hell do you think you are? Do you think you can run this damn museum?" Something that was almost is that Jonathan's face, his entire head, gets this sort of pinkish color. And then he just articulates this wonderful answer, and it was just, we kind of looked at each other and said, he's the guy, he can handle all the stuff. But afterwards, says, "Jeff, what the hell were you doing? What was that?" But it was part of a technology, a process that I later used in interviewing other candidates at Channel 8. Second quick thing I want to say, it really sounds like Oscar came up with an idea, went right to Scott, got the money, he hired Dennis Berry, and we built the museum. There's a period of 3 or 4 years of dedicated hard work. There were week after week, we would bring in different berries around the country, different people that said, "This is an idea how we will do the mob museum." Alan Feldman, other members of the community were there doing this interview process. There was a lot of hard work that took place. And even after we got the Berries on board, who everybody agrees, the decision was, what was the mob museum really going to be like? Was it going to be an attraction in the sense of because they had done the Michael Jackson exhibit, or was it going to be a museum? And the idea was we were pushing more towards the idea of a museum in that it would be facts. Oscar was pushing the fact that this had to be accurate and true so we could stand up and look everybody in the face and this is what the museum was about. Then there was some push, we were going to say, well, maybe we should have an exhibit, a big exhibit, the mob killed JFK. That was immediately pushed to the side because that was not the type of museum that we wanted to be. and museum is kind of an old word, but this is a museum. It's a legitimate, accredited museum. One of the few museums around the country that has reached that accreditation level. But it also is an interesting museum. The staff and Jonathan make the exhibits interesting and entertaining and informative. And one of the key exhibits was one that Oscar got a call. Lady says, listen, I've got the St. Valentine Massacre wall. It's over at my house here in North Las Vegas. Oscar said, oh, okay. And he brought it to the group. And there were several people that went over. Ellen went over and visited. And the feeling that came back was this was, in fact, the real wall. It was a real wall. But Oscar wasn't 100%. He wanted it to be the wall, but he needed some more verification. So he called me up and he sent me over there. And I went over, and it's in her garage. It was all numbered, all of these bricks, and we went into her kitchen, and here were these binders, page after page after page, how her uncle had purchased these things, and how her uncle had opened up a bar and put it in there, and the bar went kaput, and he gave it to his sister, who gave it to his daughter, who lived in North Las Vegas, and it became. You may not know a lot about organized crime, the average person, but you do know about that wall. You do know about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And it became a piece of business that we could really say, we are a museum, this is a legitimate piece. And it was very exciting to do that. We had to keep it undercover, so we hired the folks at the Nevada State Museum, Dennis McBride. He went over there and wrapped each of the bricks and stuck them in the Nevada State Museum for a couple of years until you guys were ready to make the big announcement. So.
Thank you, Bob. Yes. So I want to go back now and give Jonathan a chance to talk. A lot of people have been talking about Jonathan. But I think it's interesting. One interesting story is about, so you're hired, you come to Las Vegas, and at that point, even though there's a committee and there's developing a board, there's no sort of infrastructure to the mob museum yet. Yeah, you're really starting from scratch. What was that like?
I really don't know where to begin after all that. But to answer your question, Jeff, I mean, it was pretty. First, just a pretty amazing opportunity. I mean, how lucky to get to work with all these folks and to do a project like this. I mean, we talked a little bit about my interview. The reason why I wanted to go for this in the first place, and I remember sending my letter to Nancy and first phone call with Mike and so on and so forth. Just if you're in the museum field, I mean, this project, so extraordinary. I mean, so extraordinary for so many reasons. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. That no city, no other organization has ever covered before. I mean, if you're doing a museum, I mean, what museums do is storytelling, and you can't do good storytelling without good stories. I mean, it's what is really most essential to having a museum in the first place. But recognizing the relationship between the city and the board, that the city was so invested in this. I mean, there are so many projects out there that the organization is on its own. This was such a remarkable public-private partnership. I mean, it was easy to recognize right away that how invested the city was. I mean, it was Oscar's vision, and it was people like Scott who were magicians at figuring out how to fund it, and the full weight of the city behind, the rehabilitation of this building. I mean, there's so many other people that we haven't even talked about that were so instrumental in getting, I think, people like Sam Tolman and, Dave Bratcher and just, the whole, and, Jorge and Dave Bowers and just everybody that, I mean, if you saw this building before, you wouldn't believe it. And, you had the full power of the city behind this project. And then you had this board of directors that, they actually incorporated back in 2007. Bob's one of the original incorporators of the nonprofit. And this board, so for years, think about that. I mean, they incorporated in 2007, didn't actually open until 2012. But, these folks are volunteers, as Jeff was saying. And Scott always used to say to me, I always, whenever I meet with him in the, early on, say, you don't know how good your board is. Like, who these folks are in the community. I mean, powerhouse. And when you have a combination like that, and I know that you don't necessarily know the players when you're thinking about where to, how to get involved with a project, but it was clear pretty early on that this was a pretty amazing kind of combination of ingredients. The city, the private organization, the volunteers, the board of directors that were involved in it, and then the subject matter in this facility. I mean, it's kind of a can't lose proposition. That's at least how it's seen from afar. Now, to your question, I mean, I do remember my first day at work was at an event in this morning, in this room. And so I arrived here at the start of the event, and there was an event. It was an event for me. It was, it was coincidental that it was on my first day. And then when the event was over, everybody left, and they went to their respective offices and where they worked. And I went to Best Buy to go get a computer and a phone, and to start. I mean, it was it was really a fascinating undertaking. I mean, on the one hand, it's exciting and daunting to be a part of a startup, which is what it was. I mean, there was no office. There was no desk, no chair, no computer, no paperclip, and nothing. There was nothing. I mean, which is, but we had the most important thing, which was a whole array of folks that were not going to let this project fail. So I got my computer, I got my phone, I went to Starbucks. And Nancy started letting me kind of hole up outside her office a little bit, and then Scott found me an office in the old engineers building, and until they all moved out, and it was weird and creepy being all alone there. But it was just a fascinating experience. We had to figure out how to make the money work. It's like other startups. I mean, you have a certain amount of runway. And that's part of you can't just start hiring everybody right away and burning, through your seed money. You got to figure out what's the right sequencing and, when do we think we can actually open, and then hold ourselves to a date, and then, start bringing on the team that was, the team to figure out how to market the place, how are you going to actually have a box office? How are you going to run every day? All that stuff, which was,
So Jonathan was employee number one, obviously. Just how many full and part-time employees do we have today?
We're right around 140.
140. Wow.
And we have over 100 active volunteers too, which cannot say enough about the volunteer team, or the employees for that matter. I mean, it's the best group of people.
And we have a few.
I do have to add one thing, and that is year after year, the Mob Museum is listed as one of the best places to work of any business in the city of Las Vegas, and it starts with the leadership at the top. The people that were hired here have that and have been infected with that enthusiasm. Jonathan has handpicked his staff. Those people see how hard he works. I don't know if anyone's ever started their own business, and very few people have, but when you think about it, Jonathan minimizes his trip to Home Depot to get supplies of whatever he needed in a paperclip, but looking at a room and there's nothing there other than an idea and a concept, and to put the people in place and to run that, to create an organization is something that requires a tremendous amount of skill, a lot of effort, and can't be minimized in any way by just saying that it happened.
You know, we've been talking about successes here, but I think that there's, over the last decade, I really think we should have another panel and talk about all the opportunities we've had for improvement, all of the mistakes, all the directions that we have shifted. I remember we had a wall of tomato cans. You remember that? We had a wall of tomato cans when we opened, and it was a reference to a certain thing. Well, we were sued, or we were, the tomato company told us to take it down or we're going to sue you. Something, and then there's a number of times that we have been offered the Bugsy Siegel gun that was made in 1975, you know, the serial number. I mean, so this is, the reason that this is really a success is because the staff here works 24/7. This is not something where you sit back and smoke a cigar. This is work, but it's work that the volunteers, the staff, the board of directors, we all enjoy being a part of. And this is an active board of directors. Sometimes I just sit back and enjoy the board of directors of 12 people when 7 of them are attorneys and they have a discussion. That's always a lot of fun, but it's all has led us in a very positive way. But it's still work. It was work to start. Remember Oscar taking a survey. Do you remember the survey you did of the community but was also the public and the community about what they think should be in this building? Watercolor and art museum, the whole list of these things, including the Mob Museum. And the Mob Museum didn't get 100, but it was very high, and it was very high with visitors, and also high with the. So it wasn't like, oh, it's going to be a success from the get-go. It was work from day one, and it's still work today. A lot of work that we all enjoy.
Thank you, Bob. I want to get to Melissa because she has some interesting memories of the early years when the museum was just getting opened. And why don't you talk about Oscar becoming a minister? We could start with that.
Before I do that, though, I just want to say, as a publicist, this was a dream. To have Oscar as the mouthpiece, every time he opened his mouth, it would reverberate around the world. And, Jeff mentioned that there was probably a lot of hesitation locally, but nationally and internationally, the mob and organized crime, there was such intrigue around that. So we were generating press 2.5 years before we opened. Every time we would announce a plan or the acquisition of an artifact, it would make news. And I mean, in the 2 months alone leading up to the museum, there were something like 2,000 print stories because, let's face it, the mob, the name mob, yes, it's a museum, and museum might be a stodgy word, but mob is not. Mob is intriguing, and this was Las Vegas. And I also want to say something before I get to the minister's story. About a year before we opened, there was the mob attraction that opened at the Tropicana. And that gave us all pause for concern. They have a year head start. They did acquire some significant artifacts, mostly from, I think, Giancana's daughter. And, every time we would read about that, we would, our heart would stop a little bit. So we had copious talking points on the points of differentiation between the mob attraction and the mob museum. And it's been touched on before. I think, Jonathan just said, we have this building. We have this historic building. They didn't have that. We had the Berries, one of the most credible museum teams in the country, and with an amazing resume. We had Oscar. They didn't have Oscar. We had city support. I mean, we had so many things going for us. And lo and behold, the mob attraction closed about I don't know, a year after we opened. I mean, it didn't last, so clearly all of our concern was for naught. But the minister story, because it's so good. So we opened, as you know, on Valentine's Day 2012, and we decided a couple months before that we would hold a contest nationwide. It was on Vegas.com, and we would seek 7 couples from around the country who wanted to get married or renew their vows here in the courtroom on Valentine's Day and be married by Oscar. And it was a wonderful campaign, and thousands of people applied. It was a random drawing. And one of my jobs was to get Oscar registered as an officiant so that he could legally marry these 7 couples. So I don't know if you've all heard of universallifechurch.com, but pretty much anybody who has a heartbeat, can get registered. So we register Oscar, the Jewish mob lawyer on Universal Life Church, a ChristianChurch.com, and they were so Twitter-pated over this. They could hardly stand it. They didn't even ask our permission, and they put out their own press release. And I have to read the first paragraph because I don't want to butcher it. This is an actual press release. Former Las Vegas mayor and former mob lawyer Oscar B. Goodman has repented and seen the light. The spirits of need stepped into his heart, prompting him to join the monastery and begin his new heavenly career as a Universal Life Church wedding minister. And mind you, I think it was $35 to register him. So he joined the monastery for $35. And then they continued to refer to him as either Brother Goodman or His Honor, Hizzoner. His Honor will officiate his first wedding on St. Valentine's Day 2012 at the new Mob Museum, formerly the old federal courthouse and U.S. Post Office in downtown Las Vegas. It was there that mob lawyer Goodman made a name for himself, representing such reputed mobsters and bad guys. I know it's allegedly, but they didn't use the word allegedly. Bad guys and they go on to name Lansky, Rosenthal's, Blatro. Today, Brother Goodman joins the ranks of celebrity ULC ministers, including Conan O'Brien, Kathy Griffin, Jeff Probst, and others. And then this thing goes on and on and on, and then I have to read the last couple sentences because they're so good. As His Honor has become an ordained minister, the monastery prays everyone will come to understand we are all children of the same universe. No greater than the trees, no lesser than the stars. We all have a right to be here, including Oscar.
Well, all I can say is this. The proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding because one of my parishioners that I married with his beautiful wife in this very room is sitting next to me here.
And Oscar, one thing you forgot when you were telling the story about the Italian-American club, you told them that you were an equal opportunity offender and you had Jewish mobsters too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I thought it was going to be a Jewish museum, to be honest with you.
Well, I have one more short video clip from Ellen speaking about something important about the museum. So I want to share that and then we'll talk about it.
Well, I just think that there are so many accomplishments, including how quickly the museum became accredited. That's major. And that the attendance has been so high. And the community service aspect of the museum is really awesome. And that's something that we had not really fleshed out. But when Jonathan came on board, that was his, number one thing. So now the museum is just a solid member of the community in many ways. Community service is what the museum does, really. So to me, I'm just very proud of that, and couldn't be happier with the way things have gone. And I see even more things, positive things happening in the future with expansion. And so I just think it's unstoppable.
Thank you. Jonathan, if you could speak just a few words about, the commitment to community. That's a big part of our core values here at the museum, and it manifests itself in a variety of ways.
Sure. Well, I think Bob was saying it really well earlier about, what do museums do? I mean, we're here, to provide a place for learning, informal education. I mean, we keep objects in the public trust, and it's for the community. And then, the real beauty of it is, and I agree with everything that was said earlier about, how wonderful the exhibit development was at the time we opened, and Jeff and team and so many others with the museum continue to refine, the exhibits. We've made a lot of progress in that regard through the years, always trying to make it better. And that is extremely, extremely important for the guests that come here on a daily basis. And at the same time, it's also, that's just the foundation. I mean, what's really amazing about the power of what museums can be is to be able to gather people, to get people to come and hear more stories, to share ideas, go back and have conversations about what they've seen. So commitment to community is one of our core values. I mean, all the folks I know that work here know that, and it's also embedded in what our mission is. And so we, right from the start, wanted to think about, there's all sorts of layers to this. What's the strategy for growing your organization? What are the various tenets of your mission? And we know that this project at its start was largely about revitalizing downtown, and that's always been extremely important to us. And we agreed early on as part of our mission that we would be a self-sustaining organization, that we would continue to commit ourselves to helping with the revitalization and vibrancy of downtown Las Vegas. And at the same time, as Jeff was mentioning, the strategy has to be, when you're in a marketplace like this that is extremely, extremely competitive, and you have 2.5 million people that live here, but 40+ million people that are visiting on an annual basis. The locals are really, really important. I mean, they're part of your immediate community. You serve them, and you also need them to be ambassadors of your organization. So we are constantly kind of walking this line between how do we present ourselves and market ourselves and attract those tourists, but not ever forget how important it is and how we need to serve, our immediate community. And so thinking about things like, public free days, like we have this coming Monday, every year on our anniversary, and every year on the anniversary of the Kefauver committee hearings that were in this room on November 15th, we're free to the public. We do community safety forums and similar types of programs that, again, about access, bringing people in and lowering those kind of the barriers that, make it difficult for some members of our community, that, that the price of entry, even though we always make certain that for locals, it's much cheaper. And we do our buy one, get ones for locals on Tuesdays, that we still need to make it even more accessible to others and provide programming that is important to people in the community. So it's not always things that are kind of the more exciting stories of organized crime and law enforcement. Sometimes it's very practical stuff, like, how do you live more safely and, avoid being a victim of cybercrime. But that's, that's part of what part of why we're here. So, one other thing I just want to get out there too is, that flies beneath the radar. People don't realize, how much outreach we do into the community. And sometimes people are even surprised to hear that. They say, Mob Museum does educational outreach. Mob Museum goes to schools. Well, yeah, we do. I mean, we've had almost 25,000 student interactions, in our 10 years. And it's actually been in the latter half of that 10 years that we've done that. And we go out, and we know that for students, particularly in Las Vegas, they don't get opportunities to go to museums as much as kids in other places. So we bring the museum to them, and we teach about Las Vegas history, and we teach about things like forensic science and constitutional law. And, that stuff, again, it's not what we're putting up in the billboards. It's not the stuff that we tout all that frequently, but it's pretty magical what happens when our educators meet a group of students and the impact that can have on those students. So that's really really just meaningful to all of us, I think.
Absolutely, thank you. So we're getting to the point. We're going to have opportunity to ask questions here in a few minutes, and I imagine there's going to be some questions. We've got a panel here that has perhaps some answers. But I want to talk, we promised in the title of this program, celebrating the past and also charting the future, right? So I think we ought to talk for just a couple of minutes about, the museum is going to be 10 years old on Monday. But of course, we're looking back tonight, but in general, we're not looking back, we're looking forward, and we have a lot of thoughts and plans about what we'd like to do. Without being, we don't have a lot of specifics, but Jonathan and maybe Jeff and anyone else, maybe just talk a little bit about what you see going forward.
When we signed the lease, a 99-year lease with the city, there was a provision in there 7 years down the road, 6-7 years down the road, and it said that if you haven't spent $7 million on improvements to the museum by this year, then the city has the right to take the building back from us. It was like a poison pill that was put in there because even as confident as we all were that this was going to be a success, there was always the possibility, and the city wanted to be able to reserve the fact that it could take the property back from us if we hadn't been able to develop it in an appropriate and profitable way. When I took over as the chair of the Mob Museum some five and a half years ago, I always said that we were alone in this world. We were an island. And if it hadn't been for people like Mike Devine, who helped us get funding from national resources, historic tax credits, and so on, really innovative type funding that only he knew about because he was a museum guy and he knew this kind of funding was out there. And we took that money and we did things for the museum. We put in the speakeasy downstairs, and we did a use of force exhibit, and we did the forensic laboratory that we spoke of. And we spent the $7 million, and we got to keep the building. And so now we're looking forward. And we've done fairly well, knock on wood, regarding our occupancy and our attendance. And we have some other resources that have come to us. And we're looking to expand again. You saw the fencing that around the side of the building. We're talking about putting an outdoor plaza because people want to have events here. They want to be close to this place. And so we have some plans. One of the members of our board is an amazing architect, and he's given us some templates that we can look at to see about how we can develop the use of this property to put a better auditorium space, so when we have an event like this, we don't have to take this particular exhibit away from the general public, but we'll have a place to go where we can have banquets, where we can have some of the presentations, like the police department has presentations for the community about safety issues and so on. We're going to give them a place to actually hold those meetings. And so those are things that are on the table right now. We're going to spend a few dollars in order to achieve that type of expansion, because like any organization, you can't just sit here and rest on your laurels. You've got to always look forward to tomorrow and take the chance to spend the money if it looks like it's an appropriate investment to do so, but at the same time maintaining a conservative reserve so that if things do happen that you need to be able to hold back and keep the organization alive during what might be a troubling time, then we'll be ready to do that as well.
Thank you. Mike, I wanted to give you one chance. Now, Mike has seen more museums probably professionally than anyone in the building, I would guess. And so you have a pretty good grasp a very good grasp on the museum industry and how things develop within our industry. Where does the Mob Museum fit within this context of the last 20 years? What's going on with museums?
Well, when we go into museums, and about half of our projects are brand new, just an idea like this one, where Mayor Oscar came up with the idea. The other half of them are major renovations of existing facilities. And when we go into those facilities, we really look at three things. And I'll kind of work backwards. Number three, what's the financial stability of that organization? Number two, what does that guest experience look like? And the guest experience, think about it in the broadest text. And then one, and the most important, is the people and the leadership. And I think what you've heard tonight, the leadership here, in my opinion, is the best of any museum that I've ever worked with and continue to work with. From Mayor Oscar to start with the idea, Ellen as initial director, now Jeff as the chair, Bob and the board, and then Jonathan's leadership in executing all this. And it's not just Jonathan, Jeff and Ashley and Mark. They're literally the best of what they do in their different disciplines. I mean, when I talk to other museums and they say, what's best practices, I set up a call with Ashley on marketing, or I set up a call with Jeff on content. And so, when we talk about looking forward, the success is going to be there because the team here is as good as there is in the world at running a facility like this. And so, we talk about the growth and the development, return on investment, all those things. It's going to be successful here. And I think that's the thing that's so exciting for me to continue to be part of this, is that the guest experience is going to be great. The stability we have financially and the structure there is great. But most importantly, the leadership and the people here are as good as there is in running a museum or a cultural attraction in the world. So very exciting to be part of.
Three quick points, real fast. One is the future is going to be the Jewish and Italian mob. But the future, there's all kinds of other organized mobs that have come around the country, whether it's in Mexico or China or Japan or wherever. Those stories are of interest to the people that come here. Secondly, we're still going to be a museum. This is not going to be the mob attraction. There's not going to be a zip line here. That's not what we were about. And it's the current one should go away, by the way. We should put life back on Fremont Street. But we're not going to be that. We're going to be a facility where we're going to have facts and artifacts that tell an interesting story. And there are lots of stories still to be told about the 20s and the 30s, and there's some artifacts that are out there, and I know what's coming. There's a redesign going on that's going to be revealed in a few weeks. So this place is full of energy, it's full of ideas, and it's full of successes, and that's due largely to the not largely, it's due to the staff. Thank you.
Oscar,
This
you get-
is a good way to wind it up, and that is to
Yep.
thank Jeff Schumacher for being our moderator today. I've been wondering what he does around here, and
Fair question.
now I see. And did a pretty good job, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you. A great job. Thank you.
Do you have any other final words, Oscar, before we take questions?
As a minister or as all I can tell you is rest in peace.
Thank you. All right, well, we'll open it up to a couple questions. Shakayla has the microphone, and so if you raise your hand, she'll come around and you can ask your question. We'll need to talk into the microphone, though. Questions? It's a rare opportunity to ask Oscar a question. Yes.
So I believe in the 90s, I was a stand-in for a motion picture that was here. It was Tax Court in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, I want to say one real quick thing. It's got nothing to do with the question and answer. One of the two favorite pieces of information that we got, and I think that we talked about it before. This was an office. There was the courtroom was on this side, and the ceilings were down here, and there was a wall that just extended. And so as they're taking these things down, we are finding those blue things there with the original color. We're finding these other things with the red color. They were revealed as this building was being Social Security, and we also found behind the judge's desk, and there was a thick metal protection, a big slab of metal, and this is back in the 30s and 40s, where the judges were pretty safe in those days, but they had that protection to kind of hide behind the desk, and nobody knew about it until we started taking things apart. But those will always remind me of the beginning and the success of this museum.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there was, this, I don't know exactly when it happened, but it reminds me of the 60s and 70s architecture. Let's cover up all the good stuff and make it look really bad. That's kind of what they did.
I do want to say one thing about the building, because the building itself is an attraction and it's on the historical places. So the Park Service sold it to Oscar. He made a hell of a deal at $1. But it's like a money pit. When they got into this place, in order to be habitable for the general public, you had to make it earthquake proof. You'd had to bring it up to the code. It cost like another $20 million in order to make this building the way it is today, and more. So it wasn't an easy thing that once we got into it, we found out it was a lot more difficult to turn this place back into something that was going to be occupiable again, and to the extent of what you see here now. But it is a magnificent place, and it's deserving all by itself of being an attraction.
And if there is an earthquake, this is where you want to be.
I was just going to say, Scott, maybe you could verify this. Is this the best place?
That is true. There's literally a building inside the building.
And in a city where we implode things when they get old, this is incredible. We're preserving history. And I do have one other really cool story. Do you want to hear it? So, Kathy and Dennis Berry in 2010, as they were starting to build the exhibits and look for content and curate artifacts, they asked me to take them to see Phyllis McGuire's home. And, I know, Oscar, I know you've been there many times. Jeff, you probably have too. I was fortunate to count Phyllis as a friend, so I set up the meeting. We went to her home, and for those of you who don't know, Phyllis McGuire was part of the Singing McGuire Sisters and the one-time lover of Sam Giancana, Chicago hitman. Now, she kind of spent the rest of her life trying to bury that and hide that. That was something that she wasn't very public about. So, but she agreed to take a meeting with the Berrys. And Her house, go home and Google her home and look at the images, and you will just be completely blown away. 26,000 square feet, a replica of the Eiffel Tower in the living room, a bar that is full size like a hotel bar with a full-time bartender, and every square inch of the wall is covered with photos of her, with Sammy Davis Jr., with the Rat Pack, and she would point out, well, here's where I played cards with Sammy, and here's where Frank and Dean and I would have a drink after a show. I mean, it was just incredible. So as we're leaving the home the first time, Dennis and Kathy got outside, and it was just a holy shit moment. That was a museum, and we wouldn't have to change a single thing, and we could literally charge admission at the door. So that just whet their appetite, and they wanted to try to court Phyllis to donate some things, some artifacts to the museum. So I took Kathy back one more time. It was a Friday afternoon. It happened to be the day of the Nathan Adelson Hospice Fashion Luncheon, and the designer was Zandra Rhodes, if anybody's a fashionista. This crazy, wonderful designer who just happened to be at Phyllis's house hanging out with her while we were there. But we show up with this giant notebook detailing every exhibit. And we sat down with Phyllis, and she looked at every page, and the elephant in the room, of course, was that she was Sam Giancana's lover at one time, and she never addressed it, she never talked about it, but Kathy and I both noticed that on every page where Giancana was featured, she would stop, she would read every word, she studied it, wouldn't say anything, and then, kept turning the pages. I mean, Jeff, I don't think she ever ended up donating anything to the museum, did she?
No.
But the berries, it was just, as museum folks, they were so excited by what they saw and how young history was here in Las Vegas.
Thank you. If you're curious, further curiosity about Phyllis, I think there's a couple of things on YouTube where she gives people tours of her home. She's passed now, but the house is amazing. We have one more question, I believe.
Hello, I'm Cassandra, and what an honor it is to stand in front of all of you. There is a mob story that I'm super intrigued with, and so I just wanted to ask Oscar, didn't you defend Frank Lapina?
Excuse me?
Didn't you defend Frank Lapina?
I defended Frank during the preliminary hearing, and at the same time, I defended Rosalie, who was his lover, at the same preliminary hearing. So when it came time for the trial, the judges said I can't represent either of them at the trial, and they each got separate attorneys, and the story is a very sad story with a very good ending.
An amazing
and that
one,
is
yeah.
Frank, after all those years, has been declared innocent. It's not a question of guilty or not guilty or setting aside. There was a finding by the Supreme Court of the state of Nevada that he was innocent of the charges of killing Hilda Krause.
Absolutely. Can I have a round of applause? He's actually sitting right next to me.
Oh, there's
Frank
Frank.
Lapina's here.
For those in the room who don't know, Frank has been employed by the Mob Museum for several years and tells stories. People come through the museum and Frank captures their attention as he tells stories about his life and his experiences, and it's just an amazing opportunity for people when they come through the museum. So thank you for that, Frank. I think that wraps it up for tonight. Well, we have one more, Shakayla? Go ahead, one more. Then we'll wrap it.
Yes, the future of organized crime to a great extent is cyber. And I'm really excited about a story that the Mob Museum can tell in the future on where cybercrime is going, but what we are doing about it. UNLV and College of Southern Nevada are two national centers of academic excellence in cybersecurity. This is a designation by NSA and DHS.
There's a lot going on in this community to address those problems, and I think the museum can do both.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dan and I have been talking about that very thing. So, well, anyway, thank you all very much. So glad everybody could come out and celebrate the Mob Museum's 10th anniversary. Thank you very much.